today is all about the 16-bit era. We're going to drill a little deeper, though. We're going to focus on the Sega Genesis.
Yes.
If you've been around the channel, you kind of know how we do these buying guides. We do it from a collector's perspective, but also from our perspective of what it's been like to collect the Genesis, why we collect the Genesis, or whatever said console.
The Genesis is kind of new to us because I didn't grow up playing one. I didn't even know the Genesis existed. So like in the past couple of years, I've really been going heavy into collecting for it, and it's been a lot of fun because it's like, oh, a new console in 2023. It's
so
crazy.
For perspective, Robert was born in 94.
Yeah.
I was born in 86. So I've got a little bit of a different vantage point with the Genesis. I did not own one. I was a Nintendo NES kid, Game Boy kid, and Super Nintendo kid, N64 kid. But all my neighbors had Genesis. Ooh. So I do have a very fond memory of the console. I even had a neighbor that had the Sega channel. I digress. We'll get into all those things, but today is all about a buying guide. If you want to start collecting the Sega Genesis in 2023, and should you even attempt collecting the Sega Genesis in 2023, let's relive kind of the console wars. Would you want Nintendo? Would you want Sega Genesis? Or do you want both?
Oh, dude, if you had both, you were living the high life.
Yeah.
So the Sega Genesis, the Model 1 came out in 89.
Yeah. 2
years before the Super Nintendo, which is crazy. So first to the scene, pretty freaking cool. I love the look of the Model 1.
Yeah, the red on here, you know, the 16-bit logo. I do love this thing. It did only, its standard audio out was only a mono signal. There is a way to change that with either different cords, or I believe there's a way you can run some audio out of this headphone jack as well and get
kind of split it, but
I don't know exactly, but I know as a kid I was always like, why is there only one audio cord? And that's how the NES was too. The Model 1, though, is kind of that nostalgic look. The weird thing is my nostalgia for the Genesis lies right here on the Model 2.
The Model 2 came out in 1994. This guy is old as me.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely insane. They did add stereo in the Model 2, which is nice.
Yeah, and I had no friends with a Model 1, as weird as that is.
That is really weird.
And a lot of my neighbor friends were older than I was. So it's odd that I just don't know if in 89, I think we were all in on the NES, and I don't think it really took traction where I was living in the Midwest until kind of that Super Nintendo era when the Super Nintendo came out around in 91. But these are kind of the two primary models of the Sega Genesis that I think collectors really like having. There was a Model 3.
Ah, yikes.
And Sega released, I think, the manufacturing to Majesco when that came out. And if you've seen it, it's just a really little console, really little puck. I have never played on one. I've seen them in game stores, conventions, stuff like that.
I've never played one either, but I've heard that it's the worst model of the Genesis. I don't know exactly why, because I've never experienced it myself, but it was released in 1998, so like almost 10 years later than the Model 1. I think maybe because they switched developers that they just messed it up and they tried making it cheaper. I don't know exactly what's wrong with it, but we have the Model 1 and the Model 2, so I don't have a reason to get a Model 3.
Yeah, and there are some obvious drawbacks. There are no ports for like the Sega CD.
Oh, yes.
And stuff like that. Yeah. So the 32X Sega CD, Frankenstein, if you will, which we're not going to cover that today, because those I look at those as other consoles that bolted into the Genesis, but it is worth noting that is, if you're a Genesis collector, an option for expansion into the 32X library and the Sega CD library.
Which is wild because that's another area that I don't know much about. You know, I'm just now getting into the Genesis and the CD and all that stuff. I'm just like, it's cool. I've seen it like all built and I'm like, that's really cool. It looks like a Transformer, but I don't know much about it.
Yeah, we've got some friends that collect that have it, but back when we were kids, nobody had that stuff. No. At least where I was growing up. Did have a kid on the street get a Sega Saturn when that came out, but nobody was rocking that other stuff that I recall anyways. So those are kind of the consoles. I think a lot of people probably prefer the Model 1's look.
Yes.
For me, I'm just nostalgic for the Model 2, so that's the one that I like and I play on the most. No particular reason. I honestly think the Model 1 looks better. It's just what I knew, so I feel good with this guy. So,
and we play the Model 2 all the time. If you want to get into the console, on eBay they go for about like $50 to $60 for like the Model 1 or the Model 2. It's not too bad. You can find bundles and stuff, and I mean it's not very common, but they are at like garage sales sometimes or thrift stores, and you just gotta keep your eyes peeled.
Yeah,
they're not super common, but they are there.
And I think from a CIB console perspective, a lot of collectors like having the original box.
Oh, yes.
It's pretty affordable to get a complete in box Sega Genesis. ironically enough. I know the one I have, I don't think I paid that much for it. It was like $100, maybe $120.
It didn't our buddy Newman get one at a game convention for like $100, and it was like minty, and it was like, dude, that's awesome.
I don't remember what he paid, 100, 150, but way less than you would expect for like if it was a Super Nintendo or something like that. So getting into the console itself is not too shabby. For anybody watching saying, well, I can emulate these games or other things, we are going to dive into that later in this episode. But again, this is geared towards those weird collectors like us that actually like the original stuff. So that's what this buying guide is mostly for. There are two different controllers. I mean, there's others. There's like the arcade stick and things like that. But mainline release controllers. The original one was this bad boy. You may remember it. The 3-button controller.
It's just so big. I remember when
the boomerang.
When I started playing the Genesis, I was like, "What is this?" Like, because it's just so massive and it just feels weird. But now that I love the Genesis, it's like, okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. But they took it to the next level, and this is a great controller. One of the better retro controllers is the 6-button controller. This was very prevalent with fighting games, but again, by the time I started playing the Genesis with my neighbor friends, this was the only controller I remember seeing, because that's what came with the Model 2.
Which is really cool. I prefer the 6-button just because it has more options, and I like the feel better, but they're pretty much the same. It just depends on what types of games you're playing, or what you're trying to get out of it. So.
Yeah, I love the form factor of the 6-button controller. Great controller, and these things are hard to kill. I mean, they have a great D-pad. I think the D-pad's better than the first one, and they just last forever. I've never had a problem with one.
No, it just plugs in and fires up. I will say, what's weird about the Genesis is it does feel like there's like the plastic feels like it's gonna break, but it doesn't. Maybe that's just a personal thing, but it always just feels like it's fragile, even though I've never had any issues.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know, something about the way it squeaks or something.
Yeah, there is a little bit of a difference in the plastic. I know exactly what you're saying. It's a feel thing.
Yeah, it's weird, but it's never broken, so I don't know why I think that, but that's just the vibe I get from
the console, the controller, they're just kind of squeaky in a way.
It's weird.
Yeah, so.
But now that you have the console and the controllers, you obviously need games.
Yeah.
And this is the fun part. There's so many awesome games for the Genesis.
One thing that I think makes collecting for the Genesis so fun, and it's my favorite console to collect for right now, is the cases.
Yes.
With NES and Super Nintendo stuff, we had those cardboard boxes, so I'm typically not inclined. I do like getting games CIB when I can on the NES and the Super Nintendo. But for Genesis, for whatever reason, I love these clamshell cases. Now, they also did have boxed cases, like our Castlevania Bloodlines is the boxed variant. But more often than not, you're going to find these clamshells, and some of them still have the hang tab.
Dude, I love when they still have the hang tab. I don't know why, it's just freaking cool.
But they're just really nice for displaying your games, protecting your games, and they had a leg up on Nintendo in this category. I mean, these cases are badass.
I think it's awesome, especially nowadays, because I feel like it just protects the game. It will last longer. I mean, we obviously made custom cases for our NES and Super Nintendo games, so it kind of replicates it. But like the clamshells are just awesome. So like when I'm collecting for the Genesis, I try and find not just loose cards, I try to find the clamshell that goes with it, just because it feels more protected and it looks awesome.
And that's just our way we want to collect. There's no right or wrong way. You can get into the Genesis way cheaper if you just go for cart only.
Yeah, way cheaper.
And there's a lot of games that are like half the price if you just go for the cartridge. So just something that I think has really made it fun to collect, because it's nice to have what came with the game when it came out.
I mean, there's a lot of good games too. Like fighting games, arcade-style games.
Yeah.
Obviously, Sonic was huge in this era. Phantasy Star, Streets of Rage. There's just so many awesome freaking games. Contra Hardcore is one of my favorite Genesis games of all time.
Yep. Konami was doing a lot of great things. Another fun thing about this era that if you're just getting into the Genesis, you maybe wouldn't know. For whatever reason, in the 16-bit era, there's a lot of games of the same name.
Yeah, this is really weird.
That are completely different games. So Batman Returns on Super Nintendo is a completely different game than Batman Returns on the Genesis.
They have the same name.
Aladdin, same name, different developers,
Lion King.
different games. Yeah, it goes on and on. The Batman Adventures of Batman and Robin. In a lot of these cases, sometimes, like with Batman Returns, I think it's obviously a better game on the Super Nintendo, completely different. But in some instances, we were the winners as gamers, because both versions are badass. The Adventures of Batman and Robin, two completely different games. One's more like a run and gun, and one's more like a beat 'em up. But they're both freaking great.
Yeah, they're both awesome. So it's kind of cool where it's like, oh, I already have that game. No, you don't.
Yes,
It's the same name. I don't understand why they or how they were able to do that.
Yeah.
It's wild to me.
It is a very unique thing to the generation, but just if you grew up a Super Nintendo kid and you don't know any better, which maybe by the time, in 2023 with YouTube and everything, everything's been talked about. It's all been done. Woo-hoo-hoo. But don't assume that, I love Batman Returns as a kid. I'm going to get it on the Genesis, but you played it on the Super Nintendo. Different game, but it is, I think, a really cool thing about just this era in general and collecting for it.
Yeah, there's just so many sweet freaking games.
Yeah, we got 3 freaking Streets of Rage games in that era.
Yeah, and then like the Turtles games are free, Hyperstorm Heist, those are freaking great. Okay, so now you have the console, the controller, you picked up some games. How are you going to play them? Ideally, you would want to get a CRT TV because plug it in originally. That's just how we play it. But a lot of people, they don't have room for a CRT, or they don't want to get then you have to get a bunch of converters and all this stuff, upscalers and all. You can do that if you want.
Yeah.
I like playing the way it was meant to be played, on OG hardware with an OG TV that was made for it.
Yeah, again, there's other ways. Maybe you don't even want to play a Genesis on a Genesis, or Genesis games on a Genesis, rather. Maybe you want to play on a Retron 5, which has HDMI out. Totally fine, play your games how you want. But I never like the argument of I don't have room for a CRT, because like when we do no death runs and stuff, we usually play on a 13-inch CRT.
It's so tiny.
It's so tiny, and we can carry it with one hand, and the games look great. I like playing them in their natural state, but that's not for everybody. So there's lots of ways to play it. If you have a modern display, you're either going to need to convert the original console, or have to get some sort of clone console to do it, or obviously an emulation box and some other things. We have more to cover on that a little bit later in the episode.
I will say, though, that I like playing OG hardware because there is just a significant amount of lag if you're going the other ways. I know there's ways around it and all that stuff, but if you're like going for like a no-death run or something like that, that stuff is very important. If you're just a casual gamer, you might not notice, and that's totally fine, but for like no-death runners and stuff, it's very noticeable.
And I did notice when we were working on our no-death run for Contra Hardcore, I can't remember where we went, but we took the Genesis Mini with us because we were going to be out of town staying at the hotel, and we're like, it's better than clunking along the old Genesis.
It's tiny,
we could notice it right away. And the D-pad on the Mini was a little wonky compared to the original. It just, I don't know, it was something worth noting.
It was weird. If I was just playing a game I didn't know anything about, I probably wouldn't notice, but I was going back and playing the original, and then on the Mini, I was like, whoa, big freaking difference.
Yeah, it matters, but it may not matter to you, the viewer. So however you want to play games, the fun part is play how you want. Who gives a shit? That's just how we like to play. So I missed out on Sega's first home console, the Master System. I did not know anybody that had a freaking Master System. It was not until probably when I was 16, 17 years old and really started pulling out my retro stuff and going to game stores more that I was like, whoa, how did I miss that console? Because I remembered the 2600, remembered the NES. Somehow the Master System, at least in Midwest North America, was just not a big deal. And I know there's other areas in the world where the NES wasn't a big deal, and that was a big deal. Cool part about the Genesis is it can be backwards compatible with those Master System games if you get the power base converter, which does go for $75 to $100.
It's a little expensive, and I've never used one. I also don't know much about the Master System. I think I've played it once or twice, and it is cool, but I don't know much about it. I don't have any nostalgia for it. I'm more of an NES kid. But that's something to keep in mind if you're getting a Genesis and you go, okay, I like the Master System.
Well, and I may piss some people off here in saying this, but if I were to go down the Master System rabbit hole, and I might someday, this would be how I would probably play the games, because I do not like the Master System controller.
Oh, there it is. Shots fired.
I don't like the D-pad, and I'm pretty sure you can plug a Genesis controller in, but I digress. I just would rather play with a Genesis controller. I think that controller is rough, and it's all about the D-pad because it's still got the 2 face buttons. I don't even think there's like a start and select, so I can't remember exactly. But again, I'm sorry if you're a Master System connoisseur. This is just coming from a kid who never freaking seen one until he was 16, 17 years old.
So now let's talk about the Sega Genesis in 2023. Why does it matter? Why should you get one? Why should you care about the Sega Genesis in 2023 when it's like 30 years old?
Because it's freaking alive and well.
It's freaking awesome.
Yeah.
I love it. Obviously, there's so many ways to play Genesis games. There's so many, like, ROMs. There's all these Genesis or Sega freaking compilations. They have been coming out since maybe the PS1, PS2 era. There's even one on the PS4, and then now the Switch offers a Genesis app. So there's always ways to play these games. So if you don't want to get a Genesis, you can still access the games, and that's still kind of cool to be able to experience them. So you could go down that route. Obviously, they make like a bunch of, if you do get the console, you can get like combo carts. Those are really cool. So you can get like the best of
like
games.
the multi-cart
Yeah,
things,
those things are really cool if you don't want to get all the games on your shelf. So many different ways to play Genesis games. Just play the games because they're fantastic.
Yeah, it's got a lot of love recently. We've seen 2 versions of a mini console come out.
Yes.
The version 1 was built like the Model 1. The second version was like the Model 2. Unique to the Model 2 is I believe there's some Sega CD games on there.
Which is
neat.
really cool.
You mentioned the Switch app. There is controllers being released, so you can play like old school Genesis controllers on modern consoles or computers, all those type of things. And they're still releasing Genesis games in 2023 at a pretty steady clip. I mean, we've seen Metal Dragon come out. We've seen there's a new Darius game out.
Yes.
Then re-releases of old games, but like a game like Ultra Core, which never got a release back in the day, it was kind of one of those lost folklore games. It got released on a physical Genesis cartridge.
Yeah, they're actually releasing real Genesis carts.
Yeah.
So that's even more reason to get an official console so you can get these carts. It's just so cool. We have a couple of them. They're like re-releasing old games too on carts for cheaper.
Yeah.
Like Hellfire trucks, and we have some of those. Those are really cool. Our buddy Retro Gamer Boy actually does a lot of deep dives into modern releases on Genesis carts. So if you want to know more or keep up to date with that kind of stuff, maybe check out his channel. He does so much stuff, and he knows a lot about the Genesis. So he's really knowledgeable. But it's just crazy how the Genesis is still alive and well.
Yeah.
And it's just so cool that they're still making stuff.
It was just such a great time. You know, that 16-bit era, I think a lot of people remember arguing on the playground and stuff like that. I personally at the time, I thought the Super Nintendo was the king of the castle.
Yes.
As I've really started collecting for the Genesis, that margin or that gap has very much closed. I still do slightly prefer the Super Nintendo, but just by a skosh. I love the Genesis. It's my favorite retro console to collect for in 2020, well, 2021, 2022, 2023. Loving the console, but I remember the time it was just cool that my friends had different consoles in their house, and when they came to my house, they wanted to play the Super Nintendo. When I went to their house, I didn't want to bring my Super Nintendo. I wanted to play their Sega Genesis, and it was just a really cool time, and I think that's why that era is never going to completely die.
Yeah.
So, is it worth it? That's what we do these. Is it worth jumping into to collect for in 2023? The buying guide question, right? For me, I would say it is. I think it's affordable to collect for. There are games that are stupid expensive, for sure. But I think you could get into, 5 to 10 to 15 pretty good titles and be pretty happy at a pretty affordable rate, especially if you aren't going for complete in box.
Yeah, especially if you get loose carts and stuff like that. It's really cool. And the console's not very expensive either. It just depends on what type of collector you are. We have a massive game room, obviously, with a bunch of different consoles, and we love playing on original hardware, so that's why we love collecting for it in 2023. If that's not the type of gamer you are, that's totally fine. Just play the games. What I do love about this era, too, is, I don't know, something about the Genesis, like versus Super Nintendo. The Genesis just feels like more edgy to me, and more, it feels more adult because like, I think there's like blood and stuff on the Genesis, like on fighting and stuff, and then on Super Nintendo, the blood was like green.
Yeah,
so,
I think
like,
that was maybe the first Mortal Kombat. Then some of the later ones on Super.
They fixed it, but like, there's something about it just feels like kind of like just punk or like skater. Like, there's a lot of like weird stuff on the Genesis, and
Nintendo was aware. You can tell by some of the commercials that they released a little bit later in the console's life. They tried edging the Super Nintendo up a little bit. I mean, there's even that Super Nintendo commercial with the butthole surfers.
Yeah, which is awesome.
It's a cool commercial, but you can tell it's like, guys, you're trying to be
trying to be the Genesis, and you're just. I mean, I love the Super Nintendo, but it's definitely felt like more family.
Yeah,
and like the Genesis was just like, oh, dude, this is badass.
It was the grungy teenager that didn't give a shit, and, played video games with Dorito dust on their fingers. But again, it's worth it to us. I think collecting, it's hard for us to say that, yes, absolutely, you have to collect for the Genesis, because we've already talked, there are so many ways to play the games. I would say, first and foremost, it's worth it to play the games.
Yeah, start there.
Then you have to answer the question of, do you want the physical stuff, or do you just want to play the games? The games are still great. They stand the test of time. A lot of them do. Some of them are dog shit. Every console has dog shit games.
Yeah.
But the Genesis is badass. That is coming from a kid born in 1986 that grew up with a Super Nintendo, and a kid that was born in 1994 and never played a Genesis until he was in his freaking teen years.
Yeah, I know.
And we love the Genesis. Not nostalgia driven for the most part. A little bit because of the neighbor kids. But you typically are more nostalgic for what you grew up with. And I love it. Favorite console to collect for in 2023.
Yeah, I think it's the console we're collecting for the most right now, and it's just so much fun to collect for. I love playing it. I love diving into new games and be like, oh, I never played this. It's just been a blast to collect for, and the Sega Genesis is freaking badass.
In the comment section below, let's get this party started. Were you a Super Nintendo kid or a Genesis kid? Question number 1. Question number 2, give us your top 5 Genesis games of all time, or one hidden gem that you think we need to try out. We would greatly appreciate it, just like we appreciate you tuning in, subscribing to the channel. And I gotta end this one in one way with one word. Sega!